The clock on the wall of First National Bank of Phoenix read 3:47 p.m. when Miguel Rodriguez walked through the glass doors, his leather jacket creaking with each step. Behind the mahogany desk, branch manager Trevor Walsh looked up from his computer screen and felt his jaw tighten. What happened next would cost the bank $4.2 million and turn a quiet Tuesday afternoon into the most expensive mistake of Walsh's career. But Miguel wasn't just any customer, and the 219 men who would walk through those same doors within the next 72 hours weren't just any group of concerned citizens. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly outside. First National Bank of Phoenix, as Miguel Rodriguez pulled his Harley-Davidson into the parking space marked Customer Parking Only. The chrome exhaust pipes ticked as they cooled, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed off the concrete walls of the shopping center. Miguel removed his helmet, revealing weathered brown skin and graying hair that spoke of 5 decades of hard living and honest work. Inside his worn leather jacket pocket, folded neatly in a manila envelope, sat the business plan that had taken him 6 months to perfect. Rodriguez Auto. Restoration wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a carefully calculated venture backed by 15 years of experience rebuilding classic cars in his garage and a growing reputation among Phoenix's vintage automobile enthusiasts. The numbers were solid. Startup costs of $85,000, projected first-year revenue of $140,000, and a client list that already included 3 confirmed restoration projects worth $45,000. Combined, the bank's interior greeted him with polished marble floors and the soft hum of air conditioning. Telestations lined the left wall, while a series of private offices occupied the right side, their glass walls offering a clear view of the loan officers at work. Miguel approached the reception desk, where a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked up from her computer. "I have a 4 o'clock appointment with Mr. Walsh about a business loan," Miguel said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language, but mastered it through decades of use. The receptionist's eyes traveled from Miguel's face down to his leather jacket, lingering on the small Iron Eagle's MC patch sewn near the collar. Her smile became noticeably more strained. "Of course, Mr. Rodriguez, please have a seat. Mr. Walsh will be with you shortly." Trevor Walsh had been branch manager of First National for 7 years, climbing the corporate ladder through careful networking and an instinct for profitable lending decisions. His office walls displayed his MBA from Arizona State University, several banking industry awards, and family photos showing him with his wife and twin daughters at various country club events. At 42, Walsh prided himself on running one of the most profitable branches in the Phoenix metropolitan area. When the receptionist buzzed his office to announce Miguel's arrival, Walsh glanced through his glass wall at the waiting area. The sight of Miguel in his leather jacket immediately triggered a series of assumptions that Walsh would later claim were based on standard risk assessment protocols. In reality, they were rooted in prejudices he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. "Send him in," Walsh said, straightening his tie and arranging the loan documents on his desk in a way that suggested bureaucratic complexity. Miguel entered the office carrying his manila envelope and a small briefcase containing financial records, tax returns, and letters of recommendation. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his demeanor respectful but confident. These were the qualities that had earned him respect in both his professional work and his motorcycle club. But Walsh was already focused on other details. "Please have a seat. Mr. Rodriguez, I've reviewed your preliminary application, and I have to say, there are some concerns we need to address." Walsh's tone carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the gatekeeper of other people's dreams. Miguel opened his briefcase and began laying out documents with methodical precision. "I understand you'll need to see proof of income, business projections, and collateral information. I brought everything your loan officer requested during our phone conversation. The next 45 minutes should have been a straightforward review of Miguel's qualifications. His credit score of 742 exceeded the bank's minimum requirements. His current income from his job at Phoenix Municipal Airport, where he worked as a senior aircraft maintenance technician, provided stable monthly earnings of $4,800. His savings account contained $23,000, and he owned his home outright, a 3-bedroom house in a modest but well-maintained neighborhood that had appreciated significantly in value over the past decade. More importantly, Miguel's business plan demonstrated genuine market research and realistic financial projections. He had identified an underserved niche in Phoenix's growing classic car restoration market, secured relationships with part suppliers, and even negotiated a lease agreement for a workshop space that included all necessary equipment for automotive bodywork and mechanical restoration. But Walsh wasn't seeing a qualified borrower with a solid business plan. Instead, he was seeing stereotypes and making calculations based on assumptions rather than facts. The leather jacket, the motorcycle club patch, and Miguel's last name combined to create a profile that Walsh mentally categorized as high risk, despite evidence to the contrary. "Your income is adequate," Walsh began, his tone suggesting that adequate was barely acceptable. "But I'm concerned about the stability of your employment situation. Aircraft maintenance can be volatile, and economic downturns often affect airport operations first." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly why I want to diversify into business ownership. The classic car restoration market has shown consistent growth, even during economic uncertainty. People with valuable vintage automobiles tend to maintain their investment regardless of broader economic conditions." Walsh barely glanced at the market research Miguel had compiled, instead focusing on what he perceived as red flags. "And this motorcycle club association, the Iron Eagles, what exactly is the nature of this organization?" "We're a riding club that participates in charity events and motorcycle safety advocacy," Miguel replied, sensing the direction of Walsh's questioning. "We've raised over $30,000 for local children's charities in the past 3 years. I have documentation of our non-profit status and community involvement if that would be helpful." But Walsh had already made his decision before Miguel finished speaking. The combination of unconscious bias and institutional prejudice had created a mental framework where Miguel's qualifications were secondary to perceived cultural associations. Walsh saw not a skilled technician with a solid business plan, but a stereotype that triggered his assumptions about risk and reliability. "Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate you bringing in all this documentation, but I'm afraid we won't be able to approve your loan application at this time. The risk profile doesn't align with our current lending guidelines." The rejection landed like a physical blow. Miguel had expected questions, perhaps requests for additional documentation or a cosigner. He had prepared for the possibility of negotiating terms or accepting a smaller loan amount. But outright rejection, based on what appeared to be superficial judgments, felt like something more than a business decision. "Could you help me understand which specific requirements I'm not meeting?" Miguel asked, maintaining his composure despite the frustration building in his chest. "My credit score, income, and collateral all exceed your published minimum requirements." Walsh's response revealed the arbitrary nature of his decision. "It's not just about meeting minimum requirements, Mr. Rodriguez. We have to consider the overall profile and make judgments about long-term viability. Your lifestyle choices suggest a level of risk that we're not comfortable taking on at this time." The phrase lifestyle choices hung in the air between them like an accusation. Miguel understood exactly what Walsh meant, and the understanding brought a flush of anger that he worked hard to control. This wasn't about his creditworthiness or business acumen. This was about prejudice dressed up as policy. "I see," Miguel said quietly, gathering his documents and placing them back in his briefcase with deliberate care. Would it be possible to speak with another loan officer, or perhaps review this decision with your supervisor? Walsh's expression hardened slightly. The decision is final, Mr. Rodriguez. I'm sure you can find financing elsewhere that might be more suitable to your particular situation. As Miguel left Walsh's office, he wasn't just carrying rejection. He was carrying the weight of discrimination that he recognized from other encounters throughout his life. But unlike previous instances where he had simply walked away and found alternatives, this time felt different. This time he had documentation, witnesses, and a community that might be very interested in learning about First National Bank's lending practices. The glass doors of the bank closed behind him with a soft whisper, but the sound seemed to echo with finality. Miguel Rodriguez had entered as a hopeful entrepreneur seeking to build his American dream. He left as someone who had encountered institutional prejudice disguised as business policy. What he would do with that experience and how his community would respond would soon become Trevor Walsh's most expensive lesson in the true cost of discrimination. The Desert Rose Bar sat on the outskirts of Phoenix, its weathered neon sign casting a red glow across the gravel parking lot where dozens of motorcycles stood in neat rows. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low rumble of conversation between men who had ridden together through decades of desert highways and life's unexpected detours. This was where the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club held their weekly meetings. And tonight, Miguel Rodriguez would share a story that would transform a routine gathering into something far more significant. Club President Danny Tank. Morrison had been riding with the Eagles for 23 years, earning his leadership through a combination of street wisdom, mechanical expertise, and an unwavering commitment to the Brotherhood that bound these men together. At 58, Tank's massive frame still commanded respect, but his true authority came from his ability to navigate complex situations with both strategic thinking and principled action. He had turned the Iron Eagles from a loose collection of weekend riders into a legitimate organization that balanced their love of motorcycles with serious community involvement. As Miguel walked through the bar's entrance, the familiar smell of motor oil and leather mixed with the aroma of grilled burgers from the kitchen. The evening's crowd included mechanics, construction workers, a retired police sergeant, 2 small business owners, and a nurse who worked night shifts at Phoenix General Hospital. These weren't the stereotypical outlaws that movies and television had conditioned the public to expect. They were working-class men who found brotherhood and identity in their shared passion for riding. Brothers, let's get this meeting started. Tank's voice cut through the ambient noise as members gathered around a collection of mismatched tables that had been pushed together to form a rough circle. The weekly ritual began with routine business, upcoming charity rides, maintenance schedules for the club's community outreach motorcycle, and reports from various committees responsible for organizing events and managing the club's modest finances. Miguel waited until the formal agenda concluded before raising his hand to request the floor. The gesture wasn't unusual. Members regularly shared personal challenges or sought advice from the group, but something in Miguel's expression suggested tonight's contribution would be different. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need to tell you all about something that happened today at First National Bank, Miguel began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of controlled anger. Something that doesn't just affect me, but reflects on all of us. The room grew noticeably quieter as Miguel recounted his experience with Trevor Walsh. He described the careful preparation, the comprehensive business plan, his strong financial position, and the qualified nature of his loan application. But as he moved into Walsh's questioning and the eventual rejection, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. This banker looked at my patch, looked at my jacket, and decided I wasn't the kind of person his bank wanted to do business with, Miguel continued. He used words like lifestyle choices and risk profile. But we all know what he really meant. Marcus Diesel Thompson, a master mechanic who owned 2 successful auto shops in Phoenix, was the first to respond. That's straight-up discrimination, brother. Your credit and business plans sound better than most small business loans I've seen approved. Tank leaned forward, his expression serious. Miguel, are you sure this wasn't just standard banking bullshit? Sometimes these loan officers get nervous about any kind of small business application. I thought about that, Miguel replied. But this guy made it clear that my association with the club was a major factor in his decision. He specifically asked about the Iron Eagles and dismissed my explanation about our charity work and community involvement. This wasn't about my qualifications. It was about his prejudices. The room erupted in a mixture of angry voices and shared experiences. Several members began recounting their own encounters with discrimination, from job interviews where their tattoos became an issue to apartment applications rejected after landlords discovered their motorcycle club membership. What emerged was a pattern of institutional bias that extended far beyond banking. Tommy Wrench Castellano, who worked as a senior supervisor at a major Phoenix construction company, stood up from his chair. I've been dealing with this kind of crap for 15 years. My crew respects me, my boss knows I'm reliable, but I still get looks when I show up to job sites wearing anything that identifies me with the club. The difference is that this time we have documentation, said Jake Sullivan, a paralegal who handled legal research for a downtown law firm. Miguel has copies of his application, his qualifications, and witnesses to the conversation. This isn't just about hurt feelings, this is about illegal lending practices. Tank raised his hand to restore order to the discussion. Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's think this through. Miguel, what do you want to happen here? Are you looking for support in filing a complaint, or are you asking the club to take some kind of action? Miguel had been wrestling with that exact question since leaving the bank. I want people to understand that discrimination has consequences. Walsh thinks he can treat people however he wants because we're just bikers who don't matter to his bottom line. Maybe it's time he learned how wrong he is about that. The suggestion hung in the air while members processed its implications. The Iron Eagles had never engaged in any kind of coordinated action against a business or individual, but they also had never faced such a clear example of institutional discrimination against one of their own. How much money do we have in First National? Tank asked the room. The question prompted a flurry of activity as members began pulling out their phones and checking banking apps. What they discovered surprised everyone, including Tank himself. Charlie Doc Reynolds, who managed the club's charitable foundation, had maintained detailed records of member banking relationships for insurance and organizational purposes. Based on what I have here, and estimating from what people are telling me, we're looking at somewhere between 180 and 220 active accounts at First National. The total balances are harder to calculate, but it's substantial. Diesel whistled low. My business accounts alone have about 40 grand sitting in their commercial checking. And that's just operating capital. There's more in savings and CDs. Similar revelations came from around the room. The Iron Eagles as a group represented a significant customer base for First National Bank. Their combined accounts included personal checking and savings, business accounts for member-owned companies, motorcycle loan financing, home mortgages, and various investment products. Many had been customers for years, some for decades. So what are we talking about here? Asked Tony Spider Martinez, an electrician who ran his own contracting business. Some kind of organized withdrawal? I'm talking about making a statement, Tank replied, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a natural leader. If First National thinks they can discriminate against our members, maybe they need to understand the financial impact of that decision. The discussion that followed revealed the careful consideration these men brought to serious decisions. This wasn't a group of hotheads looking for confrontation. These were mature adults with mortgages, families, and businesses to protect. But they were also brothers who had pledged to support each other through difficult times. Jake Sullivan raised the legal implications. We need to be careful about how we approach this. Coordinated account withdrawals could be seen as intimidation or harassment if we're not careful about our messaging and methods. What if it's not about intimidation? Suggested Doc Reynolds. What if it's simply about choosing not to do business with an institution that discriminates against our members? That's our right as consumers. The distinction was important, and Tank seized on it. Doc's right. We're not threatening anybody or trying to destroy their business. We're exercising our right to take our money to banks that want our business and treat us with respect. As the discussion continued, a plan began to take shape. It would be voluntary. No member would be pressured to participate. Those who chose to withdraw their accounts would do so individually, politely, and with clear explanations about their reasons. The action would be coordinated not as a threat, but as a collective expression of consumer choice. Miguel listened to his brothers debate strategy and logistics, feeling a growing sense of something he hadn't expected: hope. Walsh had rejected his loan application based on stereotypes and prejudices, but in doing so, he had underestimated both Miguel and the community that stood behind him. The banker was about to learn that his assumptions about bikers had been not just wrong, but expensive. By the time the meeting concluded, 47 Iron Eagles had committed to withdrawing their accounts from First National Bank within the next week. The financial impact would be immediate and unmistakable, but more importantly, it would send a message about the real cost of discrimination. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp desert air that made Phoenix bearable in October. But inside First National Bank, the temperature was about to rise dramatically. Trevor Walsh had no idea that his Tuesday afternoon decision would transform into the most chaotic week of his banking career, beginning with a phone call that would shatter his confidence in his own judgment. At 9:15 a.m., Bank President Jennifer Hartwell's voice crackled through Walsh's desk phone with barely contained urgency. "Trevor, I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention." Hartwell had built her reputation on crisis management during her 12-year tenure with First National's corporate leadership. She had navigated economic downturns, regulatory changes, and personnel issues with the kind of steady professionalism that had earned her respect throughout the Phoenix banking community. But the spreadsheet currently displayed on her computer monitor represented a type of problem she had never encountered. "Trevor, can you explain why we've had 17 account closure requests since yesterday evening, with more coming in every hour?" Hartwell's tone carried the controlled tension of someone trying to understand a rapidly evolving crisis. Walsh felt his stomach drop. "Account closures? What kind of accounts are we talking about?" "All types. Personal checking, savings, business accounts, CDs, even 2 mortgage payoffs. The total amount we're looking at losing is approaching $600,000, and that's just from overnight requests. Our customer service department is reporting a backlog of closure requests that they've never seen before." The numbers hit Walsh like a physical blow. In 7 years as branch manager, he had never seen coordinated account closures on this scale. Individual customers occasionally moved their business to competitors, but this suggested something systematic and organized. "Do we know why they're leaving?" Walsh asked, though a growing dread suggested he might already know the answer. Hartwell consulted her notes. "That's the interesting part. Every single person who's requested closure has specifically mentioned discrimination concerns and poor treatment of community members. Several have referenced someone named Rodriguez and an incident involving a business loan denial." The name hit Walsh like a lightning bolt. Miguel Rodriguez, the motorcycle club member whose loan application he had rejected less than 24 hours ago. But how could one rejected loan application create this kind of coordinated response? Jennifer, I think I know what this is about, Walsh began, his voice carrying the weight of dawning realization. Yesterday I denied a business loan application to a man named Miguel Rodriguez. He was associated with some kind of motorcycle club, and the risk profile didn't seem appropriate for our lending standards. Hartwell's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Trevor, please tell me you documented specific financial reasons for this denial. Please tell me this wasn't based on anything other than legitimate banking criteria. The silence that followed answered her question more clearly than words could have. Walsh realized that his assumptions about Miguel's qualifications might not hold up under scrutiny, especially if they were being reviewed in the context of discrimination complaints. I want to see Rodriguez's complete file on my desk within the hour, Hartwell continued, and I want a detailed written explanation of your decision-making process. If we're facing some kind of organized protest, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. As Walsh returned to his office, he could already see signs of the unfolding crisis. The customer service desk was handling an unusual volume of phone calls, and he noticed several customers in leather jackets waiting in various lines throughout the bank. What he didn't realize was that each of these individuals was methodically closing accounts while explaining their reasons to every bank employee who would listen. Danny Tank Morrison had arrived at the bank at opening time, carrying paperwork for 3 business accounts and 2 personal accounts that he was prepared to close immediately. His approach was polite but firm, and his explanation to teller Patricia Gonzalez was both clear and devastating. Ma'am, I'm closing these accounts because this bank discriminated against one of our community members yesterday. Miguel Rodriguez was denied a loan, not because he wasn't qualified, but because your branch manager didn't like his association with our motorcycle club. We've decided to take our business to institutions that treat people fairly. Patricia had worked for First National for 6 years and had never encountered a situation like this. Tank's demeanor was respectful and professional, but his message was unmistakable. The bank had made a serious error in judgment, and there would be financial consequences. Throughout the morning, similar scenes played out across the bank's various departments. Marcus Diesel Thompson closed 2 substantial business accounts while explaining to commercial banking officer Lisa Chen that discrimination was bad for business, both his and theirs. Charlie Doc Reynolds withdrew the Iron Eagles charitable foundation accounts while providing account manager. Stephen Park with a detailed explanation of how the bank's actions conflicted with the values his organization supported. Each member who participated in the coordinated withdrawal brought documentation, maintained professional demeanor, and clearly articulated their reasons for leaving. This wasn't an angry mob making threats. This was a calculated business decision being executed by responsible adults who had chosen to vote with their wallets. By noon, word of the unusual activity had spread throughout the bank staff. Employees who had never heard of the Iron Eagles were suddenly learning about community discrimination and its financial impact. The customer service department was fielding calls from account holders who weren't even club members but had heard about the situation and wanted to understand the bank's lending policies. Walsh spent the late morning reviewing Miguel Rodriguez's loan file with growing unease. The documentation was thorough, the credit history was strong, and the business plan was professionally prepared. Miguel's income, assets, and collateral all exceeded the bank's minimum requirements for the requested loan amount. Walsh struggled to find legitimate financial reasons for his rejection that would satisfy corporate scrutiny. More troubling was his growing realization that his decision had been based largely on assumptions and stereotypes rather than objective financial analysis. The motorcycle club association that had concerned him so much was actually a legitimate non-profit organization with documented community involvement and charitable activities. His risk assessment had been rooted in prejudice rather than policy. At 2:30 p.m., the situation escalated when local television reporter Amanda Foster arrived with a camera crew to investigate reports of coordinated account closures at First National. Foster had received a tip from a source within the Iron Eagles about potential banking discrimination and saw an opportunity for a compelling human interest story. We're here investigating reports that First National Bank has been discriminating against members of the Iron Eagles Motorcycle Club, Foster explained to Bank President Hartwell during an impromptu interview in the bank's lobby. Can you comment on the allegations and the unusual number of account closures you've experienced today? Hartwell found herself in an impossible position. She couldn't discuss specific customer information due to privacy regulations, but she also couldn't ignore the obvious pattern of account closures or the serious nature of discrimination allegations. Her response was carefully measured but revealed the bank's growing concern about the situation. First, National Bank serves all qualified customers, regardless of their personal associations or lifestyle choices, Hartwell stated. We take any allegations of discrimination seriously and are currently reviewing our lending practices to ensure they meet both regulatory requirements and our own standards for fair treatment. The television coverage would air during the evening news, but word of the story was already spreading through social media and local networks. By late afternoon, the bank was receiving calls from community organizations, civil rights groups, and even customers who weren't affiliated with the Iron Eagles but were concerned about the institution's lending practices. Walsh watched the chaos unfold from his office, realizing that his quick judgment about Miguel Rodriguez had triggered consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. A simple loan denial had become a public relations nightmare, a financial crisis, and potentially a legal liability that threatened both his career and the bank's reputation. As closing time approached, the final tally was staggering. 43 accounts closed, 1.2 million in deposits withdrawn, and a growing public relations crisis that showed no signs of abating. The Iron Eagles had demonstrated that discrimination had a price, and First National Bank was learning that lesson in the most expensive way possible. But for Miguel Rodriguez, watching the evening news coverage from his living room, the day's events represented something more valuable than financial revenge. They represented a community, standing up for its members and proving that respect couldn't be bought, but its absence could certainly be costly. Thursday morning brought a different kind of energy to First National Bank as corporate executives from the regional headquarters descended upon the Phoenix branch like investigators arriving at a crime scene. Regional Vice President Richard Blackstone had flown in from Dallas overnight, bringing with him a team of specialists in crisis management, legal compliance, and media relations who would spend the day dissecting every aspect of the Rodriguez loan denial. Blackstone had built his career managing problem branches and resolving situations that threatened the bank's reputation or financial stability. In 25 years with First National, he had dealt with embezzlement scandals, regulatory violations, and economic crises that had shuttered entire departments. But the situation in Phoenix presented unique challenges that combined financial loss, public relations disaster, and potential legal liability in ways that defied standard corporate playbooks. The morning briefing in Jennifer Hartwell's office revealed the full scope of the crisis. Legal counsel Maria Santos presented a preliminary assessment that sent chills through everyone present. The Rodriguez loan denial appeared to violate multiple federal fair lending regulations, including the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act. The pattern of account closures and media attention had transformed what might have been a simple discrimination complaint into a high-profile case that could attract regulatory scrutiny and civil rights investigations. The problem isn't just the loan denial itself, Santos explained, reviewing the documentation Walsh had provided. It's the documented reasoning and the language used during the meeting. When a loan officer specifically references lifestyle choices and risk profiles based on membership in a legal organization, especially when the applicant meets all financial qualifications. We're looking at textbook discrimination. Walsh sat in the corner of the conference room, watching his career implode in real time. The executives weren't asking for his input or seeking his perspective. They were treating him as the source of a contamination that needed to be contained before it spread further through the organization. Meanwhile, the Iron Eagle's coordinated response had evolved beyond simple account closures into something approaching a community movement. Word of the bank's discriminatory practices had spread throughout Phoenix's motorcycle community, reaching clubs and riding groups that had no direct connection to the Iron Eagles, but shared similar experiences with institutional prejudice. At Desert Custom Cycles, a popular motorcycle dealership and gathering place for Phoenix riders, owner Sam "Gears" Patterson had spent Wednesday evening fielding calls from concerned customers who banked at First National. Patterson, a respected figure in the local motorcycle scene, had known Miguel Rodriguez for years and vouched for his character and business acumen. "This isn't just about one loan or one club," Patterson explained to a group of riders gathered around his shop's coffee station. "This is about how institutions treat people who don't fit their narrow idea of acceptable customers. Miguel's one of the most honest, hard-working guys I know, and his business plan was solid gold." The ripple effects extended beyond the motorcycle community as word spread through social media and local networks. Phoenix area Hispanics, many of whom had their own experiences with banking discrimination, began sharing their stories and expressing solidarity with Miguel's situation. Small business owners who had faced similar challenges with traditional lenders started organizing their own responses. By Thursday afternoon, the hashtag #RespectAllCustomers was trending on local social media platforms, accompanied by photos of account closure receipts and statements supporting fair lending practices. The story had evolved from a simple business dispute into a broader conversation about discrimination, community solidarity, and corporate accountability. Back at First National, the crisis management team was discovering that their standard damage control strategies were inadequate for this situation. The Iron Eagles weren't demanding money or making threats. They were simply taking their business elsewhere while clearly explaining their reasons. There was no negotiating position, no settlement demand, and no obvious path to resolution that didn't involve fundamental changes to the bank's practices and personnel. "We need to understand what it would take to stop this hemorrhaging," Blackstone told his team during an emergency strategy session. "How do we reach out to this motorcycle club and find out what they want?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. The Iron Eagles didn't want anything from First National except to be treated with the same respect and fairness extended to other customers. Their response wasn't about extracting concessions. It was about demonstrating the consequences of discrimination and supporting their community members. Communications Director Janet Wheeler had been monitoring social media and news coverage throughout the day, tracking the story's evolution from local news item to broader social justice narrative. "The problem is that this has moved beyond just the motorcycle club," she reported. "We're seeing support from civil rights organizations, small business advocacy groups, and community leaders who are framing this as part of a larger pattern of discrimination against minorities and non-traditional customers." The afternoon brought another devastating development when Miguel Rodriguez appeared on local television for a detailed interview with Amanda Foster. Miguel's calm, articulate presentation of his experience contrasted sharply with the stereotypes that had influenced Walsh's decision, making the discrimination even more obvious to viewers. "I've lived in Phoenix for 15 years, Miguel told the camera, his voice steady and professional. "I pay my taxes, I volunteer in my community, and I've built a reputation as a skilled craftsman. But when I walked into that bank wearing a leather jacket, Mr. Walsh saw a stereotype instead of a qualified applicant. That kind of prejudice has no place in business, and it certainly has no place in an institution that's supposed to serve the entire community. The interview included testimonials from other Iron Eagles members about their positive contributions to Phoenix, their charitable work, and their status as law-abiding citizens and taxpayers. Charlie Doc Reynolds discussed the club's fundraising efforts for local children's hospitals. Marcus Diesel Thompson talked about employing 12 people in his auto repair businesses and his perfect payment history on multiple business loans from other banks. The segment painted a picture of discrimination that was both clear and damaging to First National's reputation. By evening, the story had been picked up by Phoenix television stations and was generating calls for broader investigations into the bank's lending practices. Inside the bank, Walsh was summoned to meet with Blackstone and the crisis team for what everyone understood would be a career-ending conversation. The review of his decision-making process revealed not just poor judgment, but a pattern of assumptions and biases that created legal liability for the entire institution. "Trevor, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation," Blackstone began, his tone carrying the weight of corporate authority. "Your decision has cost this bank over $2 million in deposits, created a public relations nightmare that's affecting our entire regional operation, and exposed us to potential federal investigations that could result in millions more in fines and legal costs." Walsh attempted to defend his actions by referencing standard risk assessment procedures, but his explanations crumbled under examination. Miguel Rodriguez's loan application met or exceeded every objective criterion the bank used for similar approvals. The rejection had been based entirely on subjective judgments rooted in prejudice rather than policy. "We're placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation," Blackstone continued. "This situation has grown beyond what any individual branch can handle, and we need to demonstrate to regulators and the public that we take these allegations seriously." As Walsh cleaned out his desk that evening, he could see the continued stream of customers closing accounts and the news crew setting up for another live broadcast from the bank's parking lot. His quick judgment about a motorcycle club member had triggered consequences that would reverberate through the institution for months to come. For Miguel Rodriguez, watching the evening news from his workshop, where he was already beginning renovation work on his first independent restoration project, the day's developments represented something more significant than personal vindication. They proved that communities could hold institutions accountable for their actions, and that respect and fairness weren't just abstract principles, they were business necessities with real financial implications. The Iron Eagles had demonstrated that discrimination carried a price, and First National Bank was learning that lesson in the most public and expensive way possible. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miguel Rodriguez's modest home workshop, where the sound of metal grinding and classic rock music had been replaced by the quiet hum of local news crews setting up equipment in his driveway. Attorney Catherine Morales had driven across Phoenix after receiving calls from 3 different civil rights organizations, each urging her to contact the man who had inadvertently sparked the largest discrimination protest in recent Phoenix banking history. Morales specialized in employment and lending discrimination cases, building her practice on the principle that institutional prejudice could only be challenged through systematic legal pressure and public accountability. She had followed the First National Bank story with professional interest, recognizing patterns she had seen throughout her 15-year career, representing clients who faced discrimination in housing, employment and financial services. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm not here to convince you to file a lawsuit," Morales explained as they sat in Miguel's living room, away from the media attention outside. "But I think you should understand the broader implications of what happened to you, and the potential impact your case could have on discriminatory lending practices throughout Arizona. Miguel set down his coffee cup and studied the attorney's earnest expression. Since Tuesday's loan denial, his life had transformed from quiet pursuit of business ownership into something resembling a social justice campaign that he had never intended to lead. The attention was overwhelming, but the support from his community and the clear evidence of institutional change suggested that his experience might serve a purpose beyond personal vindication. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Miguel asked, his tone reflecting both curiosity and caution. Morales opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder containing research she had compiled over the past 2 days. "I've been investigating First National Bank's lending patterns, and your case appears to be part of a broader problem. Over the past 3 years, they've denied business loans to Hispanic applicants at a rate that's statistically significant when compared to their approval rates for similarly qualified white applicants. The data Morales presented painted a disturbing picture of systematic discrimination, disguised as standard banking practices. Miguel's rejection wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was part of a pattern that suggested institutional bias embedded in the bank's lending culture. The Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency take these patterns very seriously," Morales continued. "A formal complaint backed by statistical evidence and documented cases like yours could trigger a comprehensive investigation that would force First National to change their practices across all their branches." Miguel listened carefully, understanding that his decision would affect not just his own situation, but potentially hundreds of future loan applicants who might face similar discrimination. The weight of that responsibility was significant, but so was the opportunity to create lasting change. Meanwhile, at First National Bank's corporate headquarters in Dallas, an emergency board meeting was underway as executives grappled with a crisis that threatened to expand far beyond the Phoenix branch. Regulatory Affairs Director James Mitchell had spent the morning fielding calls from federal banking regulators who had become aware of the situation. Through media coverage and preliminary discrimination complaints, we're looking at potential federal investigations from multiple agencies, Mitchell reported to the assembled board members. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency has indicated they're reviewing our Phoenix lending practices, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has received complaints that could trigger a pattern and practice investigation. Board Chairman William Harrington had built his career on avoiding exactly these kinds of regulatory entanglements. At 67, he had navigated the banking industry through multiple economic cycles and regulatory changes. But the Phoenix situation represented a new type of reputational and legal threat that could affect the bank's federal charter and regulatory standing. "What are our options for resolution?" Harrington asked, his tone reflecting the urgency of containing damage that was spreading throughout the organization. Corporate Counsel Elizabeth Porter had been coordinating with crisis management specialists and federal regulatory experts since Thursday morning. Her assessment was sobering. The bank's exposure went far beyond the immediate financial losses from account closures and extended into potential federal fines, regulatory sanctions, and ongoing monitoring that could last for years. The Rodriguez case has created a spotlight that's illuminating broader problems in our lending practices, Porter explained. Even if we resolved his individual situation, we're now dealing with federal agencies that want to examine our institutional policies and statistical lending patterns. The conversation that followed revealed the true cost of Trevor Walsh's discriminatory decision. What had begun as one rejected loan application had evolved into a threat to the bank's regulatory standing, its reputation in multiple markets, and its ability to operate without federal oversight. Back in Phoenix, the Iron Eagle's coordinated response had achieved something unprecedented. It had forced a major financial institution to confront the consequences of discrimination in real time. The final tally of account closures reached 67 members, with total deposits withdrawn exceeding $2.8 million. But the financial impact was only part of the story. Danny "Tank" Morrison had received calls throughout the week from motorcycle clubs in Tucson, Flagstaff, and even cities outside Arizona, asking for advice on organizing similar responses to discrimination in their own communities. The Phoenix action had become a model for how organized communities could hold institutions accountable for prejudicial treatment. What we've proven is that respect isn't optional. Tank explained during a Friday evening meeting at the Desert Rose Bar. Businesses that want our money need to treat us with the same dignity they show every other customer. And when they don't, there are consequences. The meeting's atmosphere was markedly different from the previous Tuesday's gathering, where anger and frustration had dominated the earlier discussion. Friday's conversation reflected satisfaction with their collective action and pride in their community's response to discrimination. Marcus Diesel Thompson reported that his new bank, Phoenix Community Credit Union, had not only welcomed his business accounts, but had expressed interest in establishing relationships with other Iron Eagles members. They told me they judge customers based on their financial qualifications and character, not their appearance or associations. Imagine that similar success stories emerged throughout the room as members shared experiences with financial institutions that had competed aggressively for their business once word spread about their departure from First National. The coordinated withdrawal had demonstrated their collective economic power while forcing them to discover banking relationships that offered better service and more respectful treatment. For Miguel Rodriguez, Friday evening brought a decision that would define not just his own future, but potentially affect discriminatory lending practices across the region. After hours of consideration and discussions with his family, his attorney, and his Iron Eagles brothers, he decided to pursue formal legal action against First National Bank. This isn't about revenge or getting rich, Miguel explained to Catherine Morales during their evening phone call. This is about making sure that other people don't have to go through what I experienced. If my case can help change how banks treat people, then everything that's happened this week will have been worthwhile. The decision to file a federal discrimination lawsuit would escalate the situation into a legal battle that could last years and cost the bank millions in legal fees, settlements, and regulatory compliance. But for Miguel, it represented something more important than financial compensation. It was an opportunity to transform his personal experience with discrimination into systemic change that would benefit future generations of loan applicants. As the weekend approached, First National Bank faced a crisis that had grown from a simple loan denial into a federal case study in discrimination and community organizing. Trevor Walsh's quick judgment had triggered consequences that would reverberate through the banking industry for years to come, proving that prejudice carried a price that extended far beyond individual transactions to institutional accountability and regulatory scrutiny. 6 months after Miguel Rodriguez first walked into First National Bank, seeking a business loan, the gleaming chrome of a fully restored 1967 Mustang Fastback reflected the Arizona sun in the expanded workshop that had become Rodriguez Auto Restoration. The business that Trevor Walsh had deemed too risky was now operating at full capacity, with a 3-month waiting list for custom restoration projects and annual revenue projections that far exceeded Miguel's original business plan. The transformation hadn't come without struggle. Phoenix Community Credit Union had approved Miguel's loan application within 2 weeks of his First National rejection. But the real victory lay in the systematic changes that had emerged from his discrimination case. Catherine Morales had built a federal lawsuit that exposed lending patterns affecting dozens of minority applicants across multiple First National branches, resulting in a $4.2 million settlement and a consent decree requiring comprehensive changes to the bank's lending practices. The settlement announcement came during a packed press conference at the offices of the Arizona Civil Rights Coalition, where Miguel stood alongside community leaders, fellow Iron Eagles members, and other discrimination victims whose cases had been uncovered during the federal investigation. The financial compensation was significant, but the institutional reforms were revolutionary. This case proves that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's financially devastating for institutions that practice it, announced federal judge Sarah Martinez as she explained the terms of the consent decree. First National Bank will operate under federal oversight for the next 5 years, with mandatory bias training, statistical monitoring of lending decisions, and community investment requirements that will benefit the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. The oversight provisions were comprehensive and costly. First National would be required to hire independent monitors to review all loan applications, implement new training programs for all lending officers, and establish a $10 million community development fund specifically designed to support small businesses owned by minorities and women. The bank's lending practices would be scrutinized quarterly by federal regulators, with any patterns of discriminatory behavior triggering additional penalties and extended oversight. For Trevor Walsh, the consequences had been swift and career-ending. Terminated during the initial investigation, he had been unable to find employment in the banking industry as word of his discriminatory practices spread throughout Arizona's financial community. The man who had once prided himself on profitable lending decisions had become a cautionary tale about the cost of prejudice in modern banking. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual accountability. The publicity surrounding Miguel's case had inspired similar investigations at banks throughout the Southwest, leading to policy changes and increased awareness of discriminatory lending practices across the region. The Iron Eagles' coordinated response had become a model studied by civil rights organizations and community groups nationwide. Danny Tank Morrison reflected on the transformation during the Iron Eagles' annual charity ride, which now attracted over 500 motorcycles and had raised $125,000 for Phoenix Children's Hospitals. 6 months ago, people saw us as troublemakers who banks didn't want to deal with. Now we're recognized as a legitimate community organization that other institutions actively court for our business. The change in perception had been dramatic. Phoenix Community Credit Union had not only approved multiple Iron Eagles business loans, but had sponsored the club's charity events and hired several members for part-time security and maintenance positions. Other financial institutions had followed suit, recognizing that the motorcycle community represented significant economic power and community involvement that had been overlooked by traditional banking approaches. Marcus Diesel Thompson had expanded his auto repair business to 3 locations, financing the growth through loans that recognized his strong business track record, rather than judging him based on his appearance or associations. The difference between being treated as a stereotype versus being seen as a qualified business owner is literally millions of dollars in economic opportunity, he explained during a panel discussion about discrimination and small business development. The Iron Eagles themselves had evolved through the experience, developing new programs for financial literacy and small business development that helped members navigate lending processes and build relationships with supportive institutions. What had begun as a response to discrimination had transformed into a comprehensive approach to community economic empowerment. Charlie Doc Reynolds had documented the club's transformation in a detailed report that was now being used by sociology professors at Arizona State University to study community organizing and institutional change. We proved that organized communities can hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions, he wrote. But more importantly, we demonstrated that respect and fair treatment aren't just moral imperatives, they're business necessities. The academic attention had brought unexpected opportunities. Miguel found himself speaking at business schools and civil rights conferences about entrepreneurship, discrimination, and community solidarity. His story had become a case study in how individual experiences of prejudice could catalyze broader social change when supported by organized community action. First, National Bank had struggled to recover from the reputational damage and financial losses. The Phoenix branch had seen continued customer defections even after implementing new policies, as community members remained skeptical about the institution's commitment to fair treatment. Regional Vice President Richard Blackstone had been reassigned to a smaller market, and the bank's Arizona operations remained under intensive federal scrutiny. The most significant change, however, was in the banking industry's approach to community outreach and inclusive lending. Miguel's case had become required reading in banking compliance programs nationwide, and federal regulators had adopted new guidelines for identifying and preventing discriminatory lending practices. The cost of prejudice had been quantified in ways that made discrimination a liability no institution could afford. As Miguel put the finishing touches on the Mustang's engine, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from loan rejection to business ownership to civil rights advocate. The workshop buzzed with activity as his 3 employees worked on projects ranging from classic car restoration to custom motorcycle fabrication. The success of Rodriguez auto restoration had exceeded every projection in his original business plan, proving that Trevor Walsh's risk assessment had been not just discriminatory, but spectacularly wrong. The afternoon brought a familiar sound, the rumble of approaching motorcycles as Iron Eagles members arrived for their weekly gathering at Miguel's shop. The tradition had developed organically, with brothers stopping by to check on projects, share business advice, and maintain the bonds that had proven so powerful in their collective response to discrimination. Tommy Wrench Castellano pulled up on his restored Harley, followed by Jake Sullivan and several newer members who had joined the club after hearing about their successful stand against institutional prejudice. The Iron Eagles had grown from 47 active members to over 80, attracting riders who wanted to be part of an organization that had proven its commitment to community values and mutual support. "You know what the best part of all this is?" Tank asked Miguel as they watched club members examining the restored Mustang. "It's not the money or the publicity or even the policy changes. It's proving that when people stand together for what's right, they can change systems that seemed impossible to challenge." Miguel nodded, understanding that his individual experience with discrimination had become something larger through the collective action of his community. The Iron Eagles had transformed a moment of prejudice into a movement for justice, demonstrating that respect couldn't be bought, but its absence could be very expensive. As the sun set over Phoenix, casting long shadows across the workshop where Miguel's American dream had finally found expression, the sound of motorcycles and laughter filled the air. The man who had been denied a loan because of stereotypes and prejudice had not only built his business, but had helped build a more just community where respect and fair treatment were no longer optional. Trevor Walsh's quick judgment had cost First National Bank millions of dollars and triggered federal oversight that would last for years. But more importantly, it had proven that discrimination carried consequences that extended far beyond individual transactions to institutional accountability, community empowerment, and the fundamental principle that in America, everyone deserved to be judged by their qualifications rather than their appearance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.